All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, which is, I believe, our fifth in our series of webinars in what we call the award program, which is academic writing and research development. And just to briefly remind you what this is all about, is the award program was an idea that was originally brought about through conversation between basically myself and especially Jennifer Euler, who I'll introduce in a minute, from what's called the RELO office, the Regional English Language Office attached to the US Embassy here in Brazil. Because we both had noticed that there was a growing interest among several universities here in Brazil in developing writing centers, and people just really didn't know how to do it. And I run a writing center here that I started at the University, Federal University of Paraná here in Curitiba, Brazil, UFPR or UFPR. And as writing centers go, we're one of the older ones here, and because we know how great writing centers can be, we wanted to help promote and encourage people to create their own writing centers in Brazil. And that gave us the idea, that led to the idea of actually putting together kind of network. And this is what Award is all about for now, as a network of writing centers that we will build in, especially right now in the state of Paraná, and who knows what the future may bring to expand it. And to kind of launch and celebrate this network, which we're still making happen right now, and to kind of raise interest, increase interest in it. We as thanks to again to Jennifer Euler of the RELO office, created this writing center series with inviting really amazing speakers with expertise and experience in running writing centers, and who have researched writing centers from the United States, which is basically the birthplace of writing center research and activity. Really, it all started there in North America. And we have invited these great voices and great minds from writing center literature and writing center experience and knowledge to share those insights with us here, to celebrate this moment of growing interest and writing center establishment here in Brazil, but also to help us grow a community of practice, one that we hope will continue to grow here in Brazil, but in dialogue with other writing centers internationally, not only in the United States, but elsewhere around the world. And so today we bring back, by popular demand, Dr. Talin Phillips, who runs a writing center that specializes in graduate writing support at Ohio University. And before I reintroduce her, I'd like to pass the virtual mic over to Jennifer Euler of the RELO office. Jennifer?
Thanks, Ron. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Oh, I think you mute.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here again this evening with all of you and talking about academic writing and particularly writing centers. As Ron mentioned, this has been an ongoing conversation that he and I have had around his work at the Federal University in Paraná, but a wider conversation here in Brazil, one in which I've encountered in many state and federal universities, the federal institutes, and also a number of other universities who have a desire to support faculty writing, student writing, and to create a way of sustaining that support over time. And I'm really excited to be part of this series. As Ron mentioned, I'm from the Regional English Language Office, or RELO, here in Brazil, which is one of 25 offices worldwide, embedded with the US Embassy and consulates. I'm a diplomat, I work at the US Embassy, and we focus on teaching and learning English throughout the school system, really, supporting teachers, supporting the system of teaching and learning, whether it's in basic school, secondary school, with secretaries of education, or in this case, in higher education with universities. And we have a lot of free resources available to support you in exploring teaching and learning, which I would invite you to explore on our website at the US Embassy. But we also have some of the best minds, as Ron mentioned, and best spirits who can interact through an exchange program called the English Language Specialist Program. And so Talin is here today as an English language specialist supported by the US Department of State. And she's a great representative of what that program can do in public webinars like this, or perhaps in supportive projects with universities across Brazil or in other countries as well. And if you're interested in exploring working with an English language specialist, either on writing centers or on another topic that is strategic for you and your institution, I would also invite you to reach out to us and to get to know us and to let us know what your needs are. I'm really passionate about academic writing. I think it's important, and it's one of the ways in which our scientific communities, our educational communities thrive, grow, and learn through that kind of exchange. And I know it's an under-supported area in many institutions here and around the world. And I was thinking about today's topic before hearing from Talin about having an online presence. We planned this webinar series way back in, before we knew that there would be a pandemic.
Before times.
Before we knew this would go on so long. And so I think it has taken on a much more important meaning. That's not a well put together sentence, but it's more important now than ever in exploring how we can support people virtually. And I know that many of you look forward to this conversation. I look forward to it as well. And I invite you to be an active part of the community, to have a conversation in the chat box, to ask your questions, and to get to know each other and share some of the practices that are ongoing in your environments. I think it enriches the conversation and we all benefit from it. So I won't go on any further, but I'm excited to be partnering with the Federal University in Paraná. And I invite all of you to be part of our community from the Regional English Language Office in Brazil. So I can't wait to hear from you, Talin, and to learn more tonight about being virtual and creating an online presence. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Jennifer, once again, for being a champion of this initiative in Brazil and for supporting this great project. And I'd like to now turn it over to Talin. Now, today's topic, I think, is particularly timely because, well, I mean, obviously, we are in a time, in a period in which a lot of the activity that we're doing in writing centers is virtual. I mean, I'm sure Talin is as well. I'm part of a community on Facebook called Directors of Writing Centers, and it seems like every other day there's a question about how do we do what we used to do in person? How do we do that online? We're all still learning on that about this. At the same time, I think that for many of us, and I would say this is true for us as well, there's been some lemonade made out of the lemons that were brought to us last year.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I'm hoping that Talin can spotlight some of that lemonade for us. So thank you once again, Dr. Talin Phillips, for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you. I have just noticed that I don't have a share screen option.
Okay, let me fix that then. Let me see if there's something that I can do here. How about now that I've given you
Yes, there we go.
Powers. Okay, there you go. All right, and so over to you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I had a brief moment of panic there. Was all going so well, and then, okay. All right, well, I mean, thanks so much for having me back. I'm so excited about this whole project, and I'm really excited to have the chance to talk to you all today about how, as you continue planning your writing centers, what can it look like to take them online in different kinds of ways? How do we develop an online presence? As Ron and Jennifer both said, we have certainly learned some things in this last year. As I was preparing this week, I was like, oh my gosh, how different would this presentation have been a year ago? It's like you can't even hardly compute how much things have changed. But as difficult as all this stuff has been, I think one big benefit has been that you guys are all going to be able to put these new knowledge and skills that you've learned in the last year into practice right away, developing writing centers. Whereas, some of us that have been doing the writing center gig longer were not pushed into doing all of the online things that we are now. So you guys are going to come in really well equipped for that piece, I think. So to get us started off, I want to hear about what you've been learning about working online in the last year. So maybe you're in a writing center setting already, or maybe you're in another teaching or student support capacity, but how have you been reaching your students or writers differently since the pandemic started? What are some new skills you've learned? What are some things that maybe, I'd used Zoom before, but I'm a lot more comfortable with it now. I've learned how to do a lot more things in it than I could before. So if you want to add some of your own experiences to the comments, we would love to hear those, and we'll work those in here in a few minutes. While you're writing, I'll tell you a couple of my own takeaways. As Ron and Jen mentioned, I direct the Graduate Writing and Research Center at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio in the US. And so we work primarily with graduate students or postgraduate students, as you would probably call them. We opened 7 years ago, I think, and we did not initially offer online tutoring. I'll talk more about why we did that in a bit, but we have been for at least the last 5 years. Before the pandemic began, about a quarter of our sessions had been online, and all of our tutors were trained to work online, but we didn't. I'm sorry, something is going on with my phone and won't stop. This is remarkably persistent, really. Okay, sorry. I need my phone to prop up my notes. So it's sitting right here in front of me. Okay, so before the pandemic started, we were maybe doing a quarter of our sessions online, and it was basically just for remote students who had, were finished with coursework and had moved far away, or for whatever reason weren't able to come during our regular hours, but it was primarily folks that just didn't live anywhere near our campus. So everybody tutored online, but I don't think anyone would have described themselves maybe as terribly comfortable with it or that they really liked doing it. But like pretty much everyone else, we've been tutoring exclusively online since the middle of last March. Our pandemic timing was such that we went on spring break and we never came back. And everything has been online ever since then. And we're going to continue tutoring online exclusively all through the summer, and perhaps into August when we start our new semester as well, just depending on how the vaccination rollouts continue here in the US. So while everybody was technically able to tutor online, no one was used to doing it or doing a lot of it or doing it in the multiple platforms that we're using now. So for me, I think that the biggest thing I've learned during the pandemic in terms of writing center work is that there's a sense in which doing workshops online I found to be much easier than doing them face to face. And I never would have guessed that. I was quite intimidated by the idea of online workshops as the pandemic was first starting, and we're sort of looking at the things that we had scheduled to do for the rest of the semester and thinking, I just can't get my head around how I'm going to move all of these things into an online platform. I think it was like managing the tech piece on top of leading the workshop itself just seemed too overwhelming. But because I have young children and we are able to get childcare between 9 and 5, basically, but not get it at other times, doing any kind of work in the evenings or weekends has been really difficult for me ever since I had kids. But this is really a problem since a lot of our graduate programs happen in the evenings and or on weekends. So it's always been a struggle. It's always been something that I felt guilty about, trying to figure out how to help those students without basically making myself and my family crazy. And so I've usually restricted it to a few after hours kinds of activities per semester. This September, when we started our new semester and we moved all of our workshops online, as I'm scheduling things, it suddenly kind of dawned on me, actually, the time doesn't matter anymore. I could do one of these at 8 o'clock, put the kids to bed, jump on the computer, go through this workshop, and that would be okay. I mean, maybe there are other ways that I could spend my evening, but this isn't a huge hardship to have to do this. It's certainly a lot easier and more efficient than driving back to campus, making copies, setting up a room, waiting to see maybe nobody shows up after you've done all that work, you know. So I'm very eager to be working with students face to face again, but I'll definitely keep doing some online workshops even after the pandemic's over, partly so that I can keep reaching these students that can't come during the regular day and people that don't live nearby. So what about you? I don't know if we've gotten any responses yet in the chat. How are you reaching writers differently? What are some of the things that you've learned?
Well, Jennifer mentioned that she can only speak about her own workplace. In place of having a face-to-face discussion, we have become better about using online document sharing, comments, and
Yeah.
explaining changes rather than editing. I think all of us feel this is easier than it was at the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. And that translates very directly into writing center work for sure.
And I would echo that, and also say that we're just like you. We're beginning to see that there are some interesting possibilities that weren't there before, and um, things like whereas before we had to go to campus and make photocopies and all of that, we can actually do that much more easily and with more flexibility with time in the virtual environment. All those things that you mentioned, we also feel that way. But in addition to that, it's actually made it so that we're able to reach members of the community that we weren't able to reach so easily before, because we have satellite campuses that kind of distant places geographically that now there's no the only limitation is having an internet signal. That's it. They're able to do the same thing whether they are next door or in another city.
Yeah, I think there's been something about in the last year as we've gotten so much more comfortable with these platforms and that learning curve finally leveled off. Suddenly you can see these possibilities that you couldn't see before. So our topic today is obviously, what can an online presence look like? How do we develop one? I think the pandemic has made really clear that while we might certainly want to develop an online presence, we don't necessarily need to do something that's like everybody else, and we don't all need to do all of the things. An online presence can mean a range of different things. It can be a scheduling system. I think that's one important piece, so that you don't necessarily need personnel in order for writers to make appointments, and they can make them whenever they need to, in the middle of the night instead of waiting until a phone line opens. Online tutoring is the most significant one, and the one that we're going to spend the most time talking about today. I've already mentioned online workshops. Some writing centers are also moving special events online and holding retreats, marathons, and other kinds of writing groups. I've been running an online writing group this semester. And, again, I would like to be seeing these folks face to face, but I don't think we're missing a whole lot by being online, and it's much, much easier for everybody. So all of these things are sort of direct, sustained interactions with writers, but they're happening in online spaces. Then there are also different ways of engaging with students or providing some kind of indirect or limited instruction through online sources. So this can be social media engagement, web development, And then there's kind of this space in the middle where you're using social media to engage writers in some kind of activity or meeting. So things like tweet chats. I know the Consortium for Graduate Communication actually is running one, I think, right now, which is why I'm not there. So these different kinds of ways of interacting through the social media platform itself. And now that everyone's online all the time, I think there's more pressure than ever to kind of measure up and to do what other people are doing. There's so many cool possibilities out there, and it's easy to feel like I need to do that too. So what I really want to focus on today, though, is out of all these possibilities, how do you decide what to do? What's actually best for your writers and your writing center? How do you make good decisions about the limited resources that you have about how to develop that online presence? And what I'm going to suggest here is that some kind of online presence is essential. But I think for a developing writing center, an online presence might also be your lowest priority, depending on what else you have to establish. I think being online in some way is important. Being in line in all the ways that I was just identifying maybe isn't. And so I don't want people to leave today feeling like they got a longer to-do list of all these things they've got to figure out before they can start their writing center. I want you to leave with a heuristic for making good decisions for your writing center about being online. And so what I'm going to share with you this afternoon is ways to think through the problems and possibilities, and then share how we've done it at Ohio University, basically what our process has been. Because we're fundamentally pretty minimally resourced as a writing center. We don't even have any half-time staff, let alone full-time staff. We typically have 6 to 8 people, and that includes me and all of us working 6 to 8 hours a week. So we have about 50 hours for tutoring each week, and then something like 10 to 15 hours that encompasses everything else, all the admin, email, and any other programming that we want to do. So we've always had to be really strategic about how we're using our resources and about how we decide to take on something new, like online tutoring or developing a really substantial social media presence. So as you think about how to launch new writing centers, I think that our scarcity might actually be helpful for you as a model, not as a gold standard of what is possible, but of how to kind of set those priorities and stage those things over time. I think that the key to answering a lot of these questions is the idea of affordances. So if you've done much work in new media or multimodality, the idea of affordances is what something allows. What does a medium allow? What does it make possible? What opportunities or possibilities are inherent in this medium? What is it that makes it distinct from another medium? So if I kind of take that and apply it to virtual workshops, I've mostly been using Microsoft Teams for my workshops because that's what our campus subscribes to and supports. But this would be true of a lot of other digital virtual meeting platforms as well. The fact that I can send files through the platform means that I don't need to make copies, which would typically take time plus other resources. I'm not tied to a location to make those copies now. I can never run out. You never have too few or too many. I don't have to spend any time on travel. Even the 30 seconds or so that it takes me to walk from my office to the room that we usually use for workshops, or to get from my faculty building to the library where the writing center is, even that time is saved, and which allows me to schedule meetings back to back in a way that I couldn't before. Because you'd at least have to allow 10 minutes to walk and get set up, right? So in general, being virtual means I can participate in more things now, and I can use that time more efficiently instead of having to spread things out over a wider span of time. And I'm sure that a lot of you have experienced this as well in the last year. And it makes it easier for me to juggle my home life. And that's not just true for me, but also for the writers in our community who have caregiving responsibilities or who commute to campus, et cetera. So on the whole, virtual workshops are a lot more accessible, both for me and for our writers. There are also many ways to engage depending on what somebody's comfort level and interest is. You can turn on the camera, you can use the mic, right? You can share screens. And then if people have really limited bandwidth, or if they really want to multitask, they can just use the chat or just use the reaction functions. Virtual workshops are really pretty great if you're an introvert. I may not ever want to go back as a participant to working with a lot of strangers in that space. So there are definitely a lot of useful affordances with the virtual workshops. But I'm sure you've also experienced problems as well. There are some distinct drawbacks to working in these online spaces. I think the biggest one is that we get a fraction of the engagement that we had face-to-face. People tend to treat online experiences like they're watching TV, and they just don't give the level of attention that they would if we were in the same room. They're multitasking. You're probably multitasking right now as you're watching, it's like, that's what we do. And so while as presenters or teachers, we may not like that, I think we probably all have to admit that as participants, we've done it, and we're going to keep on doing it because clearly we're able to get enough out of the experience as a multitasking participant that we've met our need. And so we're going to keep doing it. So partly for this reason, I found the virtual workshops end up being a lot more like a lecture or a presentation than what to me is a true workshop where there's a lot of interaction. I've found that it's pretty tough to get people to interact very much. And those interactions with complete strangers feel a lot more awkward to me than they do when we're face to face. Sometimes you'll get people that know each other and they're really eager to engage, and that's great. But if you've got it's not a room full, if you've got a whole Zoom full or whatever of strangers, they're often quite reluctant to interact. And also that the more technically complicated that I make things in order to take advantage of what the medium can do, the more time seems to get lost to tech issues. And so for now, I'll probably reassess this again at the end of the year. But for now, I've adopted more of a get in and get out kind of approach. We know that being in these online spaces is great, but also particularly exhausting. So I share the information that I think will help them answer whatever questions they have, but I haven't been trying to build in that level of interaction that I would in a face-to-face workshop. So then if I compare the affordances and the drawbacks, there are some substantial issues on each side, I think. I honestly don't think that virtual workshops are usually as good, although maybe over time we'll all get better at that too, or we'll work out some more adaptations to make it work better. Or I might just start calling them webinars to try to communicate more that we're not expecting we're anticipating low engagement, basically. Because I think that that's going to persist really no matter what I do. But the accessibility and the ease of the virtual workshop are really, really high. I know that these are reaching students that couldn't come before. And I know that I'm able to do a lot more of them more easily. And those are really big wins for me. So as I weigh all these things out, I've decided that they're totally worth my time, and I'm going to keep doing some, even if I don't keep doing them exclusively in the future. A more rigorous way to come at this, I think, is to think about the intersection of utility and affordances. So assessing utility means taking a look at expectations. What are the expectations here from students, from my supervisor? What do people want? And then thinking about capacity, and capacity has always been a huge issue for us. Do I actually have the time to figure this new thing out? How much work is this going to be? Is it easier than doing stuff the other way? What's already available, maybe somewhere else? Is there really a need for something new here? So for instance, if you look at the Graduate Writing Center's online presence, you're not going to find a ton of resources and handouts, not because I think they're bad, not because we aren't capable of creating them, but because there are already quite a few writing centers out there that are far better resourced than we are and then I've already done that work. And so given the limited time that I have available, I would rather send students to somebody else's online resources than make new ones that are functionally doing the same thing. So that's an element of an online presence that I've chosen not to have, at least up until now. But if you happen to have been here or seen the first webinar that I did, I talked about a film project we made called Becoming an Ally, Tutoring Multilingual Writers. That was a huge project, and we did it in large part because nobody else had. We had identified this need for training materials that weren't just print-based, that really represented the complexity, fluidity of a tutoring session more accurately than a role play could. And so we decided, here's something we can do that will benefit our community, but also benefit lots of other people. So as we're assessing capacity, I think we've got to be asking ourselves, what would I do? What would I have to give up in order to do this thing? Because even if all these other factors are pulling me towards doing something new, unless I've really got that time on my hands, I'm going to have to give something up. We gave up a lot to do these film projects, and I have no regrets whatsoever. It's been totally worth it. But we made a really careful calculation there about what we were going to do. The next thing to be thinking about is personnel, and which is, does anybody else want to do this? Or is it just you? Or is it just somebody else that wants you to do it? Are you going to have to drag everybody else on your staff along with this new thing? Are you going to have to teach them a ton of stuff that they don't know now? And do you already have people on your staff that have experience in this area? A couple of years ago, we decided to start offering tutoring on multimodal projects in addition to traditional print papers. That decision was 100% about having an assistant director at the time who had great expertise in multimodal composing, who really wanted to do it. And so she taught the whole staff, and we've continued to teach each other as staff has turned over. And that's a new thing that we do now that we didn't do before, but it was totally driven by that one person's passion. And the Becoming an Ally film was the same way. We had an assistant director who wanted to do it. We looked around and said, well, we have a more diverse tutoring staff and a more diverse student population than a lot of schools have. We have an opportunity here to make a contribution that some other writing centers couldn't. And so that's what we'll try to do. And then finally, what are the technological resources that are needed here? Do I have them? Can I get them? Can I afford them? My institution, for a variety of reasons, has made it really, really difficult to purchase anything in the last year. And it's an absolute nightmare to try to get a subscription to any kind of an online service. We have a lot of software that's provided for us that is available, but if you want something that's not that, you will spend months of your life trying to get it. And so I don't. I've just given up on that. If it's not something that I'm willing to pay for myself, or that's easy to do, we're just going to work with what we've got. So we have access to people and tech resources, though, through the film school that we have on campus. And so we use that to support our film projects so that we didn't need to buy a bunch of stuff ourselves. So utility is one way, I think, of thinking through these choices that come with developing an online presence. And then the other one is affordances. And I'm not at all confident that the little division I tried to make here doesn't break down at a few points, but I still think there's something general about there being two distinct things here. So if we think about the affordances of our choices, I think the most significant one is access. And I've already talked about that in some ways. Who can participate? Who is shut out if I choose a particular program or if I opt to do stuff online? Are more people participating in this way? Are different people participating? Another piece of this is memory. What can participants walk away from this experience with? one of the things I've heard several times now from multilingual writers who have been engaged in online tutoring in this last year is that they like it a lot better because they've typically got more that they can walk out of the session with. So instead of just their own memory and whatever notes they've made, now maybe they've got a whole chat transcript that they can walk away with, or they can rewatch a recording of the video, or they can re-listen to the audio, or maybe they can watch in replay basically the tutor making comments or annotations on their paper. So there definitely seems to be a group of students that likes having all these technological benefits added to their session. These takeaways just seem to be a lot better for them. So I think that's something to consider. Another is engagement. How are people participating? And then sort of what's possible, and then what do people actually prefer to do? Are there ways that I can give them more options for engagement? And then success. Do people like it? Are people coming? Does the experience itself seem to basically work? What does this give us that we didn't have before? We'd had a program called Right Now that was similar to what a lot of other schools successfully do. We'd been running it for several years. It was just essentially a scheduled meeting time where students could come and write. So we didn't have tutoring, but we had a tutor who was available to answer any kind of discrete questions and manage the whole time. Other schools sometimes call these shut up and write. For whatever reason, they've never really drawn a crowd for us, even though they're quite successful at other institutions, but there's something, we've just never cracked the market or something, and they've never been really successful for us in terms of numbers. But we kept doing them because they required so little of us. Basically, it was 2 hours a week. I would have my assistant director do them, and he would usually be able to multitask by taking care of some email or marketing during that time. But once the pandemic started, this just became too hard and not worth it. We decided that the involvement, the engagement was so low that it wasn't worth dedicating those 2 hours. I think people are just so taxed and overwhelmed right now. It wasn't a hard decision for me to put this program aside for a while. If we're face to face again in August, we may well run it again. But for now, the success just wasn't there, even though it offered us some other things. And I think this is really closely tied to the kairos, or the timeliness. What does this moment require of us in our work? And what's possible that wasn't before? Because as much as I would urge you to think critically about where you put your time in developing an online presence, there are some things that I think this moment requires of us. And in that category, I would put having some kind of stable online presence, like a web page, social media profile, somewhere where people can just go to get the basic information about your services and how to access them. An online scheduling program so that people can make appointments remotely at any time. I kind of keep being surprised by how many folks are still using like a paper sign-up system, and I just don't know why you would want to do that to yourself. And then the last one is online tutoring, and that's where we're going to spend most of the rest of our time today, because I think the kairos of this moment is such that online tutoring is essential to writing tutoring work right now and maybe for quite a while into the future. I think the good news is if you're new to online tutoring, or if you're just starting a writing center, it's never been easier, right? There's been such a proliferation of platforms, and those platforms have been improved so much since March. And almost everyone knows how to use several of them now, whereas before we might have known one. So if you're someone who's tutored online before, what special affordances do you think it has? what have you identified as the most concerning drawbacks, maybe that a new writing center ought to consider? So we would love it if you could add your comments there and we could hear about some of your experiences too. I'm going to give you a lot of time to respond to this one. I am going to circle back to it, but you've got plenty of time to tell us about your own online tutoring experiences. So as you start planning for online tutoring, I think the most important thing to remember is that good tutors are good online tutors. You know, strong, well-trained tutors are going to be your greatest asset. We've all got preferences for how we work, right? And some people are going to acclimate and enjoy the online space more than others. Other people, I think, are really going to shine face to face. But if you have lousy tutor who is really minimally trained, they're going to keep being a lousy tutor if they move online, right? I said it in October, and I'm going to keep saying that the most important thing you can do as a writing center director is to choose good tutors and train them really well. Your writing center is never going to be better than who those tutors are. And once you have really good tutors, I don't think it's really a terribly big leap to start tutoring online, especially now that we're used to all these platforms. You definitely do need some practice finding your footing in a particular technology, especially if you haven't been teaching in it, but then it's not so terribly different from face-to-face sessions. I think another benefit of the pandemic and of everybody having to be online for so long is that we're a lot more forgiving of things that would have been mistakes or would have looked unprofessional before, because we realize just how out of control all these things are. So I think that's lowered the threshold too, whereas before you might have felt like it's an online session and it has to be perfect and I have to do it just like this. And I think we've all relaxed a little bit, and I think that's a good thing, to just give each other some grace and opportunity to transition into this. There are some things that I think that you want to consider, though. Many of these things are actually out of your control, but I think you can ease the transition for tutors with just a little bit of preparation. The biggest one to recognize is that when we're in these online spaces, we're working with a lot less information than we would have face to face. Even when we have strong bandwidth, high quality video, we're still losing information about body language, intonation, and that's before we get to all of the lags and blips and glitches and holes and things that happen because of tech failure. The loss of being able to see body language and these other fine cues really does take a toll. And I imagine I'm not the only one who's read that this is why we're finding it so much more exhausting to be on Zoom all the time than to be in face-to-face situations. And writing tutoring is really intense interpersonal work. And so losing even those little bits of information is really significant. We're relying on every single visual verbal cue that we get from a writer to help understand what they're about, what they're struggling with, how are they responding to the questions that I'm asking or the things that I'm trying to teach them or challenge them about. And we really want and need all the information that we can get. And, you know, the online platforms have come such a long, long ways, but they're still not as good as face-to-face in that respect. And kind of related to that is a recognition that no matter what technology you choose, it's going to fail. Again, hopefully this is something we've all learned by this point, but there are steps that we can all take to mitigate that, but you can't eliminate it no matter how hard you try. I'm on my third or fourth layer of redundancy, I think, right now for this webinar, because stuff didn't work. My plan to make things better failed because I had to go back to the things I was using before, right? So what you really need is a backup plan and alternative platforms for when some of this stuff fails for you. And then even though online tutoring is giving more people access to tutoring, it hasn't totally leveled the playing field. It's still uneven in ways. Our campus is in a rural part of Ohio where there's still actually quite limited access to broadband, especially outside of a city at all. One of my best tutors quit after the spring because after the pandemic started, because he doesn't have broadband and can't get it at home. And it was too difficult to try to tutor. And so I'm hoping that in August, I'll be able to get him back. But another one of my tutors often goes to his father's house in town because his father is able to have really good broadband and he's not. And so he comes into town and sometimes, takes care of his dad for a while he's doing his tutoring. So even now, people don't necessarily have adequate internet. They don't necessarily have the webcams, decent microphones. And if they do, sometimes they don't know how to use them. The good news, though, is that there are a lot of platforms now that will work. When we originally started getting requests for online tutoring, I said no, because my tutors at that time were a lot less tech savvy than they are now. And we didn't have either the capacity for that or the technology. We would have had to use Skype without any kind of institutional support. We just would have been using the free version. It didn't have a good way to share documents at that time or to annotate them in any way. And so I said, no, we're not going to do this. I don't think it'll work very well. A couple of years later, WC Online, which is the scheduling and record keeping software that we use, which has been purpose built for writing centers, they developed a pretty useful online tutoring module, and it's built right into the system. And when it first came out, I didn't love it. I would still like to see some improvements to it, although it's much better now. But we decided that we could start offering online tutoring through that platform. We still really encouraged writers to come face to face, or certainly to come face to face first and kind of establish a relationship and let the tutor get to know about your project. And then, this was mostly for doctoral students. It's like, come down once, meet the tutor, let them get to know you, really get a chance to tell them about your project without these, hundreds of interruptions that sometimes happen through the online platforms. Do that once, and then you'll be able to continue online pretty effectively. And so that was kind of how we started out. We knew that WC Online had video, it had a chat function, it had a document view where you could do some rudimentary notation functions. So we felt like we could get quite a lot of the information that way, and have a tutoring experience that was pretty comparable to what we did face to face, and better than just making an audio call or being able to read the paper but not necessarily annotate it in any way. And so the deciding factor for us really became access then, since it was something that was built into this program that we were already using and already paying for. It wasn't as difficult to decide to transition. Our writers didn't need to have a separate account or separate software. The whole thing ran through the web, so we didn't have to tell people to download something first. They would just log into their appointment, click the link, and then they were in. By the time we made that decision, I knew that there was better software out there for video calls. I also knew that Google Drive was better for free, easy ways to share and annotate documents. But this all required multiple programs and logins, and some of them my tutors and writers weren't familiar with. So I said, we'll do this, but we're going to use it in this way through WC Online. Now there's been such a proliferation of platforms, and many of us are familiar with a lot of them. And so I've changed that policy. Of the different ways that I've written with people online since the pandemic started, I have found Microsoft Teams to be the best all-around experience, because you've basically got the video call features of Zoom with the collaborative writing tools of Google Drive into one platform. And it's what our campus subscribes to. So I had to spend some time figuring it out, right? Writers can share their work through OneDrive directly into Teams. The tutors can annotate in different ways, and the writers can revise at the same time. And then the whole document reverts right to the writer, instead of in Google, you've shared it with somebody and then you've got to go in and explicitly unshare to get it back. But as I said, lots of platforms can work. I don't think that you should go out and get Teams if you don't have anything right now, but that's what we have. And so that's what we're using now. So what we tend to do is start our sessions in WC Online, because sometimes somebody's got something pretty short. And I think the WC Online platform is better with short papers than with longer ones. Certainly then, you wouldn't want to try to manage a long dissertation or something in there. But now tutors are empowered to see where the writer has been writing and what they're comfortable with, and to maybe start that session in WC Online and then decide, oh, they use OneDrive, they're comfortable with Teams, let's pop over there. Or they use Google Drive, let's pop into Google. And so they can move the session to the place that's best for the writer now. Because over time, our capacity, our personnel, our kairos have all changed in ways that now make it possible to give writers access to more platforms. As we think about, though, how sessions are different, one of the things that I've noticed is a tendency to move through the session more quickly, too quickly, I think, than I would face-to-face. I was doing some online tutoring this week to get me in the zone. And I've been reflecting, I think there's something about the lack of a physical context and the physical presence that kind of encourages me to rush. I think especially as an introvert, trying to make the awkward, getting to know somebody period go away faster. And I was wondering if, since I'm not in the writing center space, and since so much of my life is disrupted, everybody's life really is disrupted, I think it maybe feels more like I'm squeezing this session into my busy life instead of I'm working now, and that's the thing that I'm doing. How do I build this relationship with the writer and see what they need? And then I think that gets coupled pretty easily with a lack of social presence on the writer's part. If they don't have their camera, don't turn it on, maybe their environment is really loud and chaotic, or their kids are interrupting them, the technology is failing. I think we need to be aware of a lack of a physical presence and lack of a social presence reinforcing each other in bad ways. And so this is something I'm going to be a lot more conscious of as I continue to tutor with writers online. If you haven't encountered the term before, social presence is how you come across in online spaces, whether you feel like a real person. How are you interacting with people in authentic ways, in the most authentic ways that you can online? And it's the lack of social presence when people just appear as a username or an avatar and they have no other relationship with you. That's what the research has shown has contributed to a lot of the terrible behavior that we associate with online spaces like social media platforms and things. So as tutors, I think that we can strengthen our social presence by responding to writers really promptly, using profile pictures, creating online profiles when a program will allow it, sharing appropriate details about ourselves that are more personal to try to forge connections, in the way that we would do if we were making small talk face-to-face, incorporating graphics and images, maybe using video. I was talking to a colleague about tutoring asynchronously a couple weeks ago. And so this is where you basically email your paper to the writing center and somebody responds to it and then emails it back to you. And so she was saying that she's had a lot of success with sending writers audio or video comments instead of just making notes or writing a letter to the author. That the writer feels much more like they're interacting with a real person who cares about them, who is invested in their work. So making audio or video comments, and I think that her experience has held out in different research looking at the effectiveness of audio and video commenting on student papers as well. So these are some of the things that I've been noticing since I've been working online. I've got some responses from some of my tutors, but I'd really like to hear from you all first. What special affordances do you think that tutoring online offers? And are there any particular drawbacks that you've seen? Have we gotten any responses?
Yeah, we've gotten quite a bit,
Cool.
actually. So, I mean, just to kind of summarize a few of the comments, what they have in common is that it's hard to disentangle in their minds the extent to which uh, a relatively lower level engagement is to do with the virtual environment or just general pandemic fatigue,
Wow,
or
that is
both.
so true.
And so, I mean, they're just kind of agreeing with everything you said, but they have noticed that the level of engagement is just not the same, basically.
Yeah,
Um,
I had one of the worst sessions of my tutoring life this week online with this it was I couldn't figure out whether there was some big cultural gap that in communication that we were missing in terms of expectation. But when I started the call, she wasn't there. She didn't show up. And so I'm checking my email. I'm not seeing anything. I email her, just wanted to make sure now's your session and here's the info you need to log in, blah, blah, blah. So then she comes on with no camera, but I can hear her talking, but she's not talking to me. And I think she was on a phone call with something that had to do with her children, and it was not finishing up. Like, it went on for maybe another 10 minutes, and at first I'm just like, what is happening here? Can she not hear me? Is there a technical difficulty? I don't think there was. I mean, there are possible explanations, but what it felt like was she had decided that she had blocked off this time and she could use it however she wanted. And she wanted to use the first 15 minutes to finish this phone call that she was on. And so after 15 minutes, she did kind of pop in and we got started, but she seemed to be in the main room of the house with kids going crazy the whole time. And I was like, well, my kids go crazy all the whole time when I'm trying to tutor. But like, what is going on here? Like,
yeah.
it felt like she didn't care, but maybe that wasn't it. And it's very hard to tell. If that had been a face-to-face session, there would have been a conversation about so do you really want to be here? I'm feeling like maybe you're not very invested in this process. What can we do to change this? But given
Yeah.
the pandemic, I was like, there are a lot of days when I can't control my life and I don't like how it goes down, but here it is.
Yeah, I mean, all of the semiotics get lost through the virtual environment. As you said, and as some of the people who commented say, that probably weighs heavily negatively on the whole experience, because I'm sure when you run classes, the same thing happens where some people leave their cameras off. You don't know if they're smiling or not. I teach a course with a number of students, and I'm teaching a course every week, a number of students in Russia, the writing center directors in Russia right now, who I've never met before in my life. And a couple of whom I've actually only seen for a couple of seconds once they turn their cameras on and then they turn it off immediately. And as you say, I respect that. Yet at the same time, in terms of all of the interpersonal and social affective dimensions that come into simple dialogue and conversation and social relationships, that can't be a healthy thing. And so a couple of the comments that were raised, I think, relate to that. One is that, and I'll come back to this in a second, the use of Teams for writing groups. And a person asked a question about how your experience has been in terms of people is staying in the group, or do you have a lot of attrition? And then second of all, your comment about the asynchronous writing feedback, I can say that I would just like to second your colleagues' positive comments. I've done that now for a few years. Even when I had in-person classes, I liked doing video feedback, where I would just use, in my case, I would use Screencast-O-Matic and to record video and uh, and record my voice while I'm giving feedback, because before the pandemic, I saw the advantages of that because students, my students could pause, rewind, consider what I was talking about carefully without the pressure of being in this kind of asymmetrical hierarchical relationship with the professor and the student. And and here, all the intonation in my voice and all of the, which now in writing we can only achieve approximate through emoticons or something. And all of the, of course, all the research that supports the more extensive your comments, the more it's beneficial to the writer, in essence. But now in the pandemic, just what you were saying about that person who was like having a parallel conversation while they're in the session. I respect and I understand how, there are a lot of people who have young kids at home, and it's hard for them to set aside, a block of even 10 minutes to sit, in front of the computer and talk about anything, or at least not at the same time that the tutor is available. But maybe in an asynchronous dynamic, if they can, after the kids have gone to bed, maybe they have a few extra moments and they can calmly listen to your video and pay. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's something I think that we haven't done yet in the Writing Center here. But I think it's something that it's been in my mind I'd like to do. But getting back to the teams, which, by the way, one of the comments that was made here was that they're really glad that you said positive things about that, because we've been planning now for months, launching writing groups online, and we've chosen Teams for the same reason you have, which is it is what the institute here pays for. The institution pays for it here, but it also has a number of affordances that I think make a lot of sense. And so, in your experience, getting back to that original question, what has been your impression in terms of how that relates to retention? So, do you think that people have been pretty good about staying with the group, despite the fact that it's online only, or do you think that people have kind of dropped out more than they would otherwise if they were doing face-to-face, in-person group work? What's been your experience?
So I don't know that I can speak to the retention piece very well, because what we've seen here is pretty substantial drop-offs in numbers of students since we came back in the fall. In the spring, even though stuff was utter chaos, we were maxed out in terms of appointments for the rest of the semester. Spring of 2020 was the busiest semester we've ever had, but fall of this past year, I think, was the quietest. We've never had this much capacity before. So we think that just somehow we're not reaching writers for the most part because we didn't have any of those. There's no word of mouth in the hallway. There are all of these events on campus where you would usually market what you do. None of that exists. And it seems like there are just a lot of people that don't know we exist yet. So we tried to launch some new writing groups late in the fall, partly to address that because we knew people didn't know about us. And we knew that there had to be a group of people out there that was really struggling in isolation with thesis, dissertation, journal articles. So we got one group that was interested in forming, and they mostly knew each other. Even there, it was a bit of a sell, which I typically find that people aren't convinced that reading other people's stuff when they're terribly busy and overwhelmed is going to help them. And I keep telling them how it will, but it still is usually a hard sell. So I had to do some work to get all 4 of these folks to commit, but that group has been fabulous. It's one of the best groups I've ever run. They just came in on the first day and were knocking it out of the park in terms of the kinds of feedback that they were giving and the support that they were offering to each other. So far that group has been going really well. Maybe there's something about retention and size of the group. We're keeping it small enough that people do keep feeling that obligation to each other and don't feel like they can ghost the group and it won't hurt other people. I don't know.
How many people do you have in the group?
We have 4 in this one, and I typically say 3 to 5. That it, beyond 5, it's too long between rotations for people to get their stuff looked at.
Right.
So.
And how often do they meet?
Once a week.
Once a week. Yeah, that seems reasonable, more than reasonable. And that's actually very good to know that you've had success with that level of frequency, weekly meetings, and that they've kept together. So it's good to know that it works. And anybody here watching, I mean, writing groups are great, and Talin is quite an expert on it.
Well, this new group has been a delightful surprise. I really have been so impressed with what they've done thus far. And it helps when people have deadlines. So, when they're up against deadlines in their program, that certainly does push people to keep going. But yeah, hopefully it'll continue, but it's been really great so far.
See what any other comments here. Just a little funny thing that Jennifer mentioned, that she had a colleague with a parrot in a Zoom call this week. Speaking of distractions, all these things that you don't normally have in an in-person environment. Yeah. So.
It's like every day is a new adventure. Well, I did talk to my tutors a little bit about what they felt online offered them, and I was really surprised and interested in their, why does my thing not want to work anymore, in their answers. So one of my tutors said, I've improved at being able to multitask, and he's referring to multitask about the session, just to be clear, not like checking his Facebook status while he's tutoring, but multitasking during appointments. Before, I'd have to pretty much stop directly interacting with a student to check information for them on a website. Now I can continue talking with them to the same degree, not as good as if it were face-to-face, but whilst doing multiple things for the session on the computer. And a lot of my tutors chimed in with that, and even though like people had tutored on computers before, even when they weren't online, it wasn't like we were just paper and pencil or something, but there's something about our extended time in this online space that it's made it easier to do multiple things for a session at once. And then he also said, I'm finding it easier to transition from one session to the next without anyone or anything physically moving around, just kind of click end and start the next thing. And I think that the result is more time actually spent reviewing the writing and giving advice. And then Jill commented, online tutoring allows for more flexible locations. Students do not have to be in the same location as the tutor, which means they can work from home, from an office, from work. I've had students pop in online during their lunch breaks. It also means that I work even when I'm sick, which, she does not count as a universal good. But, and this was actually one of the ways that we have talked about online tutoring before this year. If you're sick, please don't get your tutor sick too. Please just transition your session to an online one, and we would be delighted to work with you. Jill also says then when the technology is working really well, tutoring online means that my notes on their papers are easier and neater to read. So she's not handwriting any comments anymore. So it's a lot easier for the writer to see what's going on. And several people commented on enjoying that as well. And then Paulina said, once tutors are able to diagnose what kind of help students need, teaching online is in fact quite effective when tutors can share screens to show students where to locate resources or to find support for the points that tutors would like to make. I personally found it a more effective way to teach students more skills towards self-sufficiency. The process of locating resources also showed students how to do research. So they're definitely seeing, and I don't know, as not that anyone would wish the pandemic to continue for a moment longer, but there have been some benefits to being stuck in these ways for as long as we have been. And I think it'll also be interesting if in 6 months or a year, when we're primarily face-to-face again, to look at how our practice has changed because of being able to employ some of these online methods back into what we're doing face-to-face. So as we wrap up here today, I'd love to hear about what you'd like to try next in your writing center. If you're thinking about moving online or expanding developing your online presence more fully, what do you want to try next? Is there a new activity, platform, strategy you want to implement? I'm going to highlight just a couple of resources here, and there will be more coming later to the page. IWCA has been running a really good series of webinars this year, the International Writing Center Association, including some that happened over the summer, several, I think, that were on tutoring online and taking your writing center online. There was one in particular on asynchronous tutoring, which was not something I attempted to talk about here. So you might want to take a look at that. A book length thing to take a look at that's more specifically about writing is Beth Hewitt's The Online Writing Conference. The Politics of the Interface, Power and Its Exercise in Electronic Contact Zones. This is an old article, but I think still really worth reading. And it's been a really influential piece within the field of rhetoric and composition, where really helping you to think through and challenging you to think through what are the politics of this program, and what is any program, how do you assess sort of what it's making possible, in what ways it might be restricting you, or what ideologies are underlying it. So even though that is a really old piece now, I still think it's worth taking a look at. I think probably the paragon in terms of online writing support is still the Purdue University Lab. They've got a ton of stuff there that's free. If you haven't taken a look at that yet, you certainly should. And then one other book length thing that might be useful for you, Ball, Shepard, and Arola's Writer Designer, a guide to making multimodal projects. So this is something that we've used with tutors to teach them how to think through what's different about multimodal projects versus print papers. And I think a lot of that carries over into the online tutoring situation as well. So those are just a couple of things to take a look at. There will be a more extensive list coming next week. So what are you going to do next? The thing I think I'm going to try to do is create a video about how to make appointments. This is something that I had planned to do last summer, and it got derailed in lots of different ways. It's also something that felt a lot more intimidating last summer than it does now. Now it doesn't feel like such a big deal, again, because of all this added time and experience. And I'm always really looking for things that ask for kind of a one-time investment and long-term benefits, rather than something that I'm going to have to keep maintaining. So that's something that I'm planning to do kind of next on my list. What about some of you guys? What are you thinking about doing next?
Well, while they posting their comments, I can tell you that we just right before our meeting, our Zoom call, Talin, we just wrapped up our writing center team meeting, and as it turns out, that's our next thing on our to-do list as well. We plan on making a video to kind of explainer video about how to sign up for and navigate teams for the writing group experience, because it's a lot easier than, I don't know. I think people like that kind of short, quick, whistle stop tour through
Yeah.
things, and that's definitely on our list now. And the other thing that we are thinking of doing, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this, because it's something that I think is also a bit controversial, which is offer the possibility of recording sessions, because that's one of the affordances that you have on Teams, for example, or other Zoom, etc., where you can ask permission to record, or offer to record something. And I think that for tutoring sessions, that might make sense, where somebody, if they consent to recording, then they can go back and revisit the points that were raised that maybe in the moment might get lost, or
yeah.
Is this something that you've thought about, or?
We haven't had a big discussion about it here. I'm pretty sure there's been discussion on the Writing Center listserv. It's like, pedagogically, I think it's great, and in terms of privacy, it's horrifying. And so how you decide to thread that needle, I don't know. I get worried, even as I was preparing my stuff to teach online in August, like, I'm making these things for class. I don't want them to be anywhere else. I don't want to find them. I don't want them to be edited and taken out of context and stuff. And it feels very intimidating, that permanency of it, and the lack of control over it, and how much it could be distorted. So I'm sure that if I said, we're going to start recording sessions now, if students wanted it, I think I have a tutor or two who would probably quit over that issue. And others would probably not care at all. But there is such a clear value to it. So yeah, I think
I've seen this point raised, and it does generate a lot of controversy. So I mean, we haven't come to any kind of deliberation about this, but I can see that, as you said, there are some pedagogical there is some pedagogical value there, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know, is it really meaningfully different in terms of privacy if you've just got the audio and not the video? Does that make us feel better? I don't know.
Thais mentions that we are about to start online writing groups, but we've also been thinking about making videos to illustrate and promote our activities. This thing about videos is, I think, really common now. It's really a lot of people coming on board. Jennifer mentioned that that they've been thinking about shorter kind of tickles, as she calls it, with useful tips. Content and video, bite-size WhatsApp messages, focusing on self-access for students. Also adds that infographics have been really effective. So yeah, I think that sort of at a glance kind of thing, sort of downloadable, PDF, quick things. I think that's something that I would like to see increased in our own writing center here too. In terms of the online stuff, I've noticed that just last year, the Online Writing Center Association finally kind of got started. OWCA, which, as a side note, I think is kind of funny, because my son watches a cartoon called Phineas and Ferb, and they actually have an agency there called OWCA, which is something like the organization without a cool acronym. And so I don't think they intended to do that, but yes, they're also called OWCA. And so there is an association now. I don't really know, you know, I'm a member, but I don't know, you know, if it's something that is going to be just part of this zeitgeist, or if it's, you know, going to take off. But I think maybe it's worth joining that too.
Yeah, definitely.
And something else, that another comment that was made here, and I think it's really interesting what you said about how even if you have the possibility of having online consultations, that you encourage people to, you know, come down and have that face-to-face at least once, come down and have that face-to-face experience. Because I think that when we finally are able to go back to campus, even though we will still probably maintain a lot of online activities, I think it's nice to maybe have the best of both worlds in that case, where you
Yeah.
have someone come in and all the affordances of that in-person experience, and then, you know, have further development of that dialogue that was opened in that first instance online, with all the affordances of online. Lola, Natalia, Junghans, who spoke, I think, the first time when you spoke on that first webinar, she made a very interesting observation that when students came in to the writing center when it was in person, it was a really different dynamic. You could break the ice through offering them a cup of coffee,
Yes.
and all of that, and that doesn't
Take
happen.
your hand.
And I would even go as far as to say, and I mentioned this during the meeting when she brought this up, is that, you know, maybe there's a cultural aspect of this as well, because I've noticed that in Brazil, that sort of initial social lubrication is really, really important to encounters. I mean, it is in the States too, but here I think maybe perhaps even more. People really, really do want to have that kind of, you know, that lead up to talking about business. They want to have a little bit of, you know, more pleasantries that are exchanged. And so that can be lost in an online experience. So, you know, what you said about, you know, having someone come down, at least for a first encounter, that might really go a long way.
Yeah, I feel like you can cover so much more all of that introductory stuff, really getting a sense of who this person is and what their challenges are and what their project is about. You can just cover that so much more quickly face to face. And then once you've established that, I think it's a lot easier to work online. But, you know, especially if you're trying to start off with somebody in an online session that's full of tech problems, it's like you can spend an hour with somebody and not have gotten hardly anywhere. And it's really frustrating for all involved. Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if anybody ever takes us up on that again in the future, or if that just totally goes away. But
and I think that actually extends to the tutors themselves, because I've also seen that the tutors are quite happy to work from home in many cases. They actually some of them report really liking it, but almost unanimously they do feel they do miss that kind of that banter that can happen between tutors, between sessions, and kind of, I just had this great session, let me tell you about it, or this person was the worst, whatever it may be. And so what I feel just talking to the tutors at our writing center, that many of them kind of say, well, you know, I'd like to have the option of continuing doing online stuff, but maybe have both. I'd come in for a few hours to do in person and have that team thing, but some hours at home. And I can see that, you know, that kind of flexibility is something that I'd like to consider.
Yeah.
When we're able to have that option.
Yeah, and even just the you're in the same space with the writer and the other tutor while the session's going on, and you overhear stuff and you chime in, and they're confused about something. Well, actually, I know the answer to that. Let me just,
Yeah.
and to be able to, I think it's much more easy if you've got other tutors around. Oh yeah, and you're struggling with this, so and so is really an expert on that. Let's see if he can pop over for a minute and answer, and that's a lot more difficult to do, I think, online.
Yeah. So maybe the message here is a hopeful one, that at some point in the future we may be able to have both, the best of both worlds. The affordances
Yeah.
that
Yeah, I hope so.
see if there's any comments. I think a lot of people are multitasking while they're watching. Yeah, but I think it's interesting to hear, while I was listening to you speak, that independently, even though you and I haven't talked about this since the last time we spoke, we've in a lot of ways, come to the same conclusions about, Microsoft Teams and why that's a useful thing to do, and the affordances inherent to those platforms. And we don't have the option here at our institution to move beyond Teams, to use Teams, for example, in conjunction with WC Online, because that's a subscription service, and
Yeah.
the university won't pay for it. And I think that's going to be the same for most Brazilian institutions. They won't be able to fork out money for and not that it's exorbitant, but it's and I've heard good things about it. But I think that we can manage, and most universities here will manage with the existing tools that they have available. We have some noise in the background here.
So I'm not able to see the chat, but you can keep adding questions and we'll get to them once Ron's able to come back.
Nope. Okay, I'm back. At a surprise technical situation here. No, I think that's it in terms of the comments. Just people chiming in to say thank you very much for the talk. That it's been very useful.
Thank you.
Abigail, who runs a writing center in Puebla, Mexico, and who was actually given an invited talk here. She says that she feels like she's still in kind of observation mode in terms of what works online. And she says that it seems like the situation hasn't stabilized enough for us to draw clear conclusions. But one thing I've seen is that tutors have found that their WhatsApp group very useful to ask each other for help if they don't feel experienced enough in what their writers need. And I've seen, I would echo that our group here, our tutors also use WhatsApp, and I have seen, and also Discord, and I've seen them do that as well. What Abigail just mentioned, this kind of, okay, what do you guys think? So the kind of dynamic that you were describing earlier, that can happen in person, where you overhear a conversation, you can ask somebody. The closest approximation that she describes is what happens with WhatsApp. It's still not quite the same thing, but it's interesting how people still feel that need.
Yeah,
to do that.
need to connect. Yeah, that's a great idea. I think one of the IWCA webinar folks was talking about using Slack, which I know my husband is a big fan of. I've never used it. This was we had a very turbulent summer here, and things did not happen. So Slack was another one of those things that I was planning to investigate over the summer and then had to abandon. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Whether we're online or not, my tutors don't necessarily overlap a ton with each other. To have some other online space where they can be interacting and sharing knowledge and resources, I think is really a great idea.
Yeah, once again, you brought a lot of themes and observations from personal experience that I'm sure a lot of people watching this today will think, gosh, that really gels with my own experience. Or if someone hasn't quite gotten involved yet in writing center work and is going to be doing it soon or thinking about doing it, it's contributed to the, okay, whoa, I have to keep that on my radar, and that's something for me to consider. And so it's been very useful.
Thank you.
Well, everybody's just kind of thanking you, and I'll do the same. That it was really, really great to see you again. And as usual, I feel like I just wish I could walk down to the nearest coffee place with you and chat for hours about this stuff. And I do. I'll send you a message because I want to compare notes on your use of Teams for writing groups, because that's something that we're going to be doing exactly the same thing here, using Teams. And who knows, maybe through that collaboration, some interesting ideas can come out, and that I hope to maybe at some point in the future bring back to the writing the directors group here on Facebook to share whatever findings that we've gotten.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, it's been such a delight to be part of this project. I wish you all the best.
Yes, thanks. Same to you. May the gods of the internet continue to send their winds your way in a good way, and continue to stay safe, everybody out there. And
Yes.
thank you for being with us again today. Next month, we have Dr. Carol Severino coming to speak with us, and so there's still more to come. Thanks again for being with us. This video will be available online soon, so we hope you will join us again, and stay safe, stay well. Take care, everybody.